Chapter 4. Larinna. "A weapon within my means," he says. Larinna stood outside Wilbur's weapon emporium, with her hands on her hips, and scowled up at what could only charitably be called a building. More accurately, it looked like someone had taken two enormous piles of driftwood, pushed them up against one another, and hung a sign on the resultant mess. Still, even getting her hands on a sharpened stick would be preferable to setting out on the open water unarmed. The shop's door grated against the uneven planks of the bare wooden floor as she entered, and Larinna had to apply the sole of her boot and force it backward before there was enough space for her to squeeze inside the little hut. Much as she'd expected, the place was as much of a shambles inside as out, with piles of rusting firearms half disassembled and then abandoned. A selection of notched cutlasses hung haphazardly from an old hat stand, and a barrel had been stuffed full of what appeared to be cannon fuses, all different lengths and tangled together in a knot that might take lifetimes to unravel. Wilbur, or at least who she presumed to be Wilbur, was a rotund middle-aged man with a balding pate and an enormous moustache that drooped far down past his chin. Similarly impressive tufts of hair protruded from his ears. The overall impression was that someone had stuffed a walrus into an apron and left it in charge of their junk room while they were out. He was pacing back and forth behind the counter, in full theatrical flow, gloved hands gesturing at the various dubious weapons that had somehow earned pride of place as display models. The target of Wilbur's patter was a young pirate with a shaved head and an impressive collection of piercings. Her glassy-eyed expression suggested that she'd been here for some time and might continue to be so, for the dealer's grandiose showmanship showed no signs of dying down. Larinna folded her arms impatiently and leaned against the doorframe to wait her turn, gingerly in case her weight was enough to bring the entire place crashing down around their ears. "On the other hand," Wilbur was saying, "there will come a time in every pirate's life when the odds are stacked against her and the situation is grim. A moment when she realizes that her beloved pistol, up until that point her constant companion and her most faithful friend, simply lacks the pure punch to deal with the ravening horde she's pitted against. Granted, yes, you're quite correct to say that the humble pistol can accurately pluck the pips from an apple from 50 feet away when in skilled hands. But when your back's against the wall, it's sheer stopping power that you need. Make no mistake about it." Wilbur reached up and took hold of a beaten and tarnished blunderbuss, placing it on the counter with as much reverence as one might show a family heirloom. "It was the stopping power that saved the life of the notorious brigand known to his friend and enemies alike as Clumsy George. Yes, the very same. When he found himself outmanned and outgunned by a crew of vicious villains with murder in their hearts. Oh yes, old George would have found himself in quite the sore spot had he not had this beautiful piece of craftsmanship clutched behind his back. For like any good blunderbuss should, this fine firearm has the kick of a mule on May Day when you're nice and close." Here he gave a cheeky wink, as if imparting some great trade secret. "If it's such a wonderful weapon," Larinna challenged, "why did this Clumsy George get rid of it?" She stepped up to the counter as the last of her patience ebbed away. Wilbur merely shrugged and responded, "He tripped and lost it overboard." Pushing the blunderbuss to one side for a moment, he leaned forward on the counter. "Am I to take it from your unfamiliar countenance and sunny disposition that you're a new arrival to our little pirate paradise?" "You are," said Larinna curtly. "And I have an appointment to keep. Faisal sent me," she added as an afterthought. Wilbur beamed. "Did he indeed? Well, I must say you found yourself in some delightfully dishonourable company, so that's a good start. Faisal's been a regular customer of mine since I was back at the old place before I went, up market." He patted a nearby beam affectionately, dislodging a couple of woodworms. "I'm sure you're just as eager as our mutual friend here to learn more about the wondrous weaponry you see all around you. Such as this rifle, for instance, which has a long and surprising history in the hands of a "Just a sword," Larinna interrupted. "And I don't need to know its life story, or which way you're supposed to hold it, or that the previous owner was a little old lady who used it once a week to kill sharks. I just need it to be sharp and well-oiled, and for the blade not to fall off in the middle of a fight. Clear?" "Ah," said Wilbur thoughtfully. "One of our deluxe models." He reached underneath the counter and heaved a dusty crate into what passed for the daylight inside the little shop, wiping it theatrically. "Now, these don't come cheaply, of course." "I have 5 pieces in my purse," Larinna said, refusing to let the blustering swindler take control of the conversation. "By the time I walk out of here, they could be your 5 pieces." She wrenched the box around to face her and rifled through its contents, ignoring flashes of golden hilts or finely detailed blades that she almost certainly wouldn't be able to afford. Finally, buried near the bottom of the selection, she found what she was looking for: a simple steel blade with a gentle curve to it and a handle wrapped with cloth to provide a sturdy grip. She swished it once or twice through the air, checking its balance. There were a couple of notches in the blade, but it'd do. Wilbur could contain himself no longer. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "Now, that sword is worth 5 pieces." Larinna allowed the coins to tumble from her palm one by one onto the counter with a series of satisfying thunk noises, tilting her palm so that the final coin went into a spiraling roll before clattering to a halt. Wilbur's eyes followed it all the way. "My time here is over." The weapon dealer let out a theatrical sigh, but Larinna could tell by the look in his eyes that the deal was already done. "5 it is," he agreed. "And you make sure that you come back and trade it in just as soon as you're ready for the next model up. You hear me?" "If your sword doesn't snap and get me killed, I just might," said Larinna, reasonably, sliding the blade carefully into her belt and making for the door without another word. It was nice to be out in the sunlight again, but not as nice, she had to admit, as feeling the weight of a weapon at her side once more. Now it was time to meet her new crew. As Larinna left for the docks, she could still hear Wilbur's booming rhetoric carried on the breeze. "Sometimes, young lady, you meet one of those customers who you simply have to get rid of as quickly as you can, or they'll talk your ear off all day. Now, as to that blunderbuss..." The sun was brushing against the distant horizon by the time Larinna made it to the dock, bathing the handful of ships there in the orange glow of twilight. Deckhands busied themselves about them, like bees around a hive, patching and repairing, loading and unloading supplies, and making ready to set sail by the light of the moon. Darkness could be a pirate's best friend, if the night was kind. Even in a crowd, Ned was easy to spot. Currently, he was hefting one lumpy object in each hand. To begin with, Larinna assumed they were casks or sacks of some kind. It was only as she drew closer that she realized she was looking at 2 struggling figures, a man and a woman. Neither seemed dressed for a life at sea. Clad as they were in heavy leather tunics, topped with purple robes made from some expensive fabric. Some sort of uniform, perhaps. Intrigued, she sidled a little closer so that she could hear what was being said. Naturally, Faisal was doing more of the talking, and were it not for the way Ned was manhandling the strangely garbed pair, Larinna might have assumed they were all lifelong friends. "I am in my heart a gentle soul," he was saying sorrowfully, "with a profound sense of love and respect for all things. For we are all the same deep down, yes? If you prick us, do we not bleed, swear and hit you? That is why it fills me with such sorrow to see my companion here upset in any way." At this, Ned tightened his grip, hefting the two cloaked figures even farther from the floor. "Since we are so alike, I am sure you both can imagine my despair when Ned tells me that we have intruders aboard our vessel. Our pride and joy, trespassers, interlopers, saboteurs. Had we not happened upon you scuttling around below decks, who knows what terrible fate might have awaited us? Now I find myself at a loss as to what should be done with you. I could have you locked in the brig, I suppose, but it really is only designed for one person." "Yeah," Ned cut in with a gravelly chuckle. "We'd have to squeeze really hard." "We had a contract," one of the figures managed to choke out. "Ah, this is very true," Faisal agreed. "A contract upon which I admit we sadly could not deliver. Even as we speak, our good captain is away explaining all of this to your superiors, whom I'm sure are also gentle souls." He paused, moving around to stand disconcertingly behind the two prisoners, and lowered his voice. "But I think perhaps we are not so trusted, yes? You suspect that maybe we did indeed acquire what you sent us to find, and assuming that we were planning to hold it for ransom, or perhaps make use of it ourselves in some way, you crept aboard our fine vessel to take it for yourselves. Ah, my heart is heavy again. You would rob us of the very clothes off our backs." Faisal rocked back and forth for a moment on his heels, frowning. Then his face split into a delighted grin. "Then we must deliver payment in kind, I think. Ned, if you would be so kind as to bring our guests aboard for a moment," Faisal said with a sweeping gesture. Larinna watched curiously as the two flailing captives were hauled effortlessly aboard and taken into the captain's cabin. She wasn't entirely sure how much of what Faisal had said was true, but she was eager to see how the intruders were about to be dealt with. These were people she might well need to entrust her life to one day, after all. How ruthless would they prove to be? Her curiosity was sated a moment later, when the same two figures, momentarily unrecognizable as they were now clad only in their undergarments, were ejected from the back of the ship and fell, bellowing into the muddy waters of the docks. They surfaced a moment later, red-faced and spluttering, and a chorus of jeers and jokes from bystanders on the dock floated after them as they sprinted shamefacedly out of sight. When she'd finished chuckling, Larinna left her hiding place and approached the ship, noting the figure of a short-haired woman holding two crossed pistols. It would be wiser not to mention that she'd borne witness to the dispute just now, she decided, and she prepared to board and knock upon the door of the captain's cabin, as if she'd just arrived. She'd barely made it to the base of the gangplank, however, before Faisal and Ned re-emerged. They didn't wave or shout, but merely waited solemnly by the railings in what she could only assume was an invitation to join them. "I see you have found yourself a sword," Faisal said mildly, as Larinna's booted feet struck the deck. And now I think it must be time for formal introductions. I am Faisal, and this is my fellow crewman, Little Ned." "Larinna," said Larinna. She paused. "Little Ned?" "I'm the younger brother," Ned said helpfully. "And this is our ship, the Unforgiven," Faisal continued. "Or to be more precise, she is the ship of the illustrious Captain Adelaide, who unfortunately continues to be occupied with ship's business on the mainland. Perhaps we can offer you a tour while we wait for her return." Larinna briefly considered declining. What, did they think she'd never set foot aboard a ship before? She was admittedly curious to poke around, though, if only to make sure that the little vessel was seaworthy. Nodding curtly, she followed after the pair. The topmost deck seemed ship-shape enough, she decided, after a cursory inspection. The ropes and rigging for the ship's 7 sails, split across 3 masts and currently furled since the ship was docked, were taut and well tied, while the heavy capstan responsible for raising and lowering the ship's anchor turned well enough at her touch. There were 8 stout cannons, primed and ready, 4 to port and 4 to starboard. The Unforgiven may have been small compared to the ships back home, but she was no less able to defend herself. Larinna didn't bother with the long climb up to the crow's nest that crowned the highest mast, but she did spend some time standing at the ship's wheel, getting a feel for the vessel beneath her as it bobbed lazily. To their credit, Faisal and Ned both seemed to understand this behavior and stood patiently by until she was ready to move on. A look inside the captain's cabin wasn't offered, nor did Larinna request one. A certain element of privacy was expected, even when sailing in cramped quarters, and she wasn't part of the crew. Not yet, anyway. Besides, there was plenty to see elsewhere on the ship, most notably the map table, which was dominated by a large and complicated chart. Larinna attempted to drink in as much of this as she could, without making it too obvious that this was her first time studying the geography of the Sea of Thieves. She was privately delighted to see that many island chains were depicted as little more than crude notes and sketches, aching to be explored. There was a tiny kitchen area near the table, with a few half-emptied pots and bottles on display, though Larinna noticed a thin layer of dust atop it all, and suspected that hot meals aboard the ship would be few and far between. No matter, for she was no cook and could get by on ship's biscuits or dried fruit for as long as required. There were hammocks here too, strung haphazardly between the beams that comprised the skeleton of the ship. To Larinna, who'd spent 3 nights as a stowaway and a 4th slumped over a table, they looked like the most comfortable things in the world. The lowest deck seemed to be used mostly for storage, and was therefore the least interesting as far as Larinna was concerned. There was a poky little brig down there too, just as Faisal had said, though it was scarcely more than an iron cage with a very sturdy lock on its door. A few stains on the floor around the bars suggested that animals had been its only occupants of late, and that they had been particularly nervous ones. All in all, she had to admit, it was a perfectly serviceable ship, if hardly the finest at the port. Ned seemed like the sort of man she could get along with just fine, and she could see herself tolerating Faisal's eccentricities on a voyage or two. The lingering question, of course, was whether or not she approved of this Adelaide woman, and she grudgingly supposed whether Adelaide approved of her. She returned to the top deck to find Ned standing peaceably at the railing, watching the docks. "That's the captain," he remarked, pointing one stubby finger out toward the distant buildings, and for a moment Larinna assumed he was referring to a middle-aged woman hauling a sack of potatoes toward a tiny sloop. As she stared in disbelief, A more distant movement caught her eye. A figure barely more than a silhouette in the dying light was pelting over the rooftops, using beams and balconies as temporary footholds with an almost balletic grace. Her path was erratic, but she was certainly making her way toward the unforgiven. As the woman drew closer, Larinna could see yet more figures, clearly pirates, judging by their outfits, and even more clearly, desperate to catch up to their quarry. They were skittering through the streets and shouting to one another in confusion, though none possessed the dexterity to leap across the rooftops and follow her directly. They did possess pistols, though, and Larinna could see flashes as the pursuers took pot shots at their target, sending bystanders skittering for cover. Alarmed, she turned to Faisal, who now flanked her at the railings. "Should we help her?" "And spoil all her fun?" Faisal grinned. "Our captain likes to show off from time to time." Larinna could spot the showmanship to Adelaide's actions, now that she was looking for it. She slashed the ropes of a heavy canopy as she passed so that it collapsed onto two of the disorientated assailants, leaving them struggling under its weight. A third found a bucket slammed forcibly over her head as she rounded a corner and then received a dizzying smack with the flat of a blade. That left three, and Adelaide was on the ground now, sprinting full pelt along the dock toward the Unforgiven. She made it up the gangplank in 3 huge bounds, pushed past Larinna without so much as a second glance, and grasped one of the starboard cannons with both her gloved hands. She wrenched it around so that its barrel was now aimed squarely at the dock, on which the pursuing trio, who had until that moment been racing toward the Unforgiven, were now frozen like something small and furry in the grip of a cobra's stare. One began, but if there was more to that sentence, Larinna never got to hear it. The cannon in Adelaide's grip let out a vengeful roar that mirrored her own snarl of triumph, sending a speeding, soaring lump of iron right into the heart of the petrified pirate gang. The cannonball tore effortlessly through the gnarled planks of the jetty, reducing them to a shower of shards and splinters and flinging everyone atop them, this way and that. By the time the smoke and dust had settled, the trio had beaten a hasty retreat, scrambling back up the sand and out of sight, in case there was more gunfire to come. "Bunch of idiots," Adelaide commented, rubbing her hands together. "Tried to stage an ambush on my way back, all because they're still sore about what happened to Barnacle Cay. Who's this?" She was addressing Faisal, so Larinna fought down the urge to step forward and introduce herself. "This is Larinna, a woman with excellent taste in both bananas and traveling companions," Faisal informed her. "She would like to join our crew." "Just Larinna, is it?" Adelaide turned to look at her properly for the first time, and the two women began to study one another. Dark-skinned and dark-haired, with eyes that flashed when she spoke, the ship's captain cut a striking figure, though it was, if you looked carefully, mostly due to her outfit. The flared jacket, a wide-brimmed hat trimmed with an oversized feather, baggy pantaloons tucked into well-heeled boots. Larinna had seen plenty of pirate outfits in her time, but this was a costume being worn by a woman barely older and significantly shorter than Larinna herself. A woman who just blew up a jetty out of spite, Larinna reminded herself. "Well," said Adelaide at last, "I, as I'm sure you know by now, am Adelaide. But I have never heard of you. Why might that be? Reputation is extremely important around here, you know." "You certainly seem to have acquired one," Larinna remarked, glancing down at the shattered remains of the boardwalk. "I wonder if that always works in your favor." Adelaide glared at her for a moment, and then nudged Faisal angrily in the ribs. "What did you tell her?" Faisal looked genuinely hurt, as much by the remark as by the elbow. Not a thing, he protested. I think it is fairly obvious to anyone that our stay at this outpost has been not altogether tranquil, and without Kyrie at our side, we are running rapidly out of friends. You're right, Larinna cut in. You don't know me. I understand that I'm a nobody out here. That's the point of this place, isn't it? A fresh start. Somewhere you're free to make what you want of yourself. She folded her arms. I'm not some swabby. I know how to sail a ship, wield a sword, and raise a glass. I can look after myself, and I can look out for others, but I don't expect you to take that on trust. What I do expect is a chance to prove myself. Adelaide twirled a lock of her hair around her finger, musing on Larinna's words. You made it this far, so you must be a halfway decent pirate or a very lucky one, she declared. Larinna felt her fingers twitch and resisted the urge to make a fist. Already she was wondering how much more of the Unforgiven's precocious captain she'd be able to stomach. And as you say, her face is not known around here, Faisal added, which may prove to be of some use to us tonight, yes? Adelaide smiled at that. Why not? We'll be no worse off, whatever happens. You see, Larinna, we recently were forced to back out of a contract with a particular group of people here in town. I don't like to lose, and I certainly don't like having to explain myself to a bunch of jumped-up, half-witted, snuff-smoking... Adelaide cut herself off and closed her eyes for a moment before continuing in a far calmer tone. Which is to say, we find ourselves interested in a new opportunity they have to offer. Unfortunately, we appear to be somewhat blacklisted for the present. Can't even show our faces without them making a fuss. But yours is a face that no one's seen before either. So, you want me to go in your place and get this contract? Larinna looked deeply unconvinced by this. This sounds too much like employment for my liking. Her lip curled in distaste as she spat out the word. Who exactly are they, and why are you willing to do their dirty work? Oh, my dear Larinna, you really must be new around here, Adelaide chuckled. Let's retire to my cabin, and I'll tell you all about the Order of Souls.